Hello and welcome to episode 7 of the Bitlemmas podcast. I'm here with B Sovereign and Drew, and today is a book review of the Democracy Project by David Graeber. The point of the book is not nostalgia about the Occupy movement. The point is a working model of what democracy actually means. And if you remember one thing from the talk today, democracy is something you do, a skill, not something you have. Now, for the thesis of the book, democracy is people governing themselves. We're going to revisit this a bunch. The system fears democracy breaking out. What does that mean? What does he mean by system? That he's talking there about the elites and the system of elites, and this breaking out. What does he mean there? We'll talk about that. Occupy worked by building a practice, not a platform. Again, what does that mean? This idea of, you've heard of the phrase, the medium is the message. Well, in this sense, the practice is the message, and we're going to dig into that. And what is Graeber's win condition? What was the goal, and how would you measure winning? He has this idea, and being an anthropologist, and he has this whole framing within all of his books where he talks about common sense or revolution not being violent revolutions like the French or the American Revolution, but a change in what is normal and what people consider common sense. So we'll talk about that. Now, how the book frames Occupy, the Occupy movement. There are different layers here, kind of three layers. There's the history. So we're going to talk about what the word democracy means historically. And he uses that in the book to try to frame what they were doing in Occupy. Also, this crisis. Now, David Graeber's most famous book and most influential book is called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And it's a pretty big book. But so he's preoccupied as an anthropologist with the idea or concept of money and its relationship culturally with debt, this idea of debt. And he actually makes that a higher priority or more influential than barter. We won't talk too much about that today. But he also talks about how that's kind of part of the levers of power historically within the West, how control was used or implemented. So that leads us into this idea of captured institutions. Captured institutions are basically, in his mind, one of the things that they use is debt. The other one is bureaucracy. We'll talk a little bit about that. Now, also, Occupy is a movement. The way that it's a movement or what it does, it's a practice of direct democracy. We'll talk a bunch about that. Now, he he has this concept or this theme of action being the message, and he wants that to be kind of a takeaway. One of the ways you can look at it is you have your freedoms because someone at some point exercised those freedoms before power could contain or notice that, oh, you have freedom there. Let me go ahead and try to contain that, to tax it, or to, all kinds of other things. But that's kind of a reoccurring theme in the Occupy movement and other activist suggestions that he has, where you're wanting to modify your tactics in order to exercise freedoms that haven't been realized yet by power.
Yeah. I think this book is a perfect lens for our work, especially by Graeber. We're looking at a history of what democracy truly meant, a crisis of captured institutions, and a movement that tried to build a direct alternative. So, I mean, the ultimate lesson is one for essentially every builder watching this. Freedoms aren't given; they exist because people built the infrastructure to protect them and insisted on using it.
Exactly. Now, what is the crisis that Graeber talks about in the book and in general? It's a common theme throughout his books. You have a couple layers here, but there's more. Financialization. This is the government, the state, plus corporate, in this case, financial institutions, colluding. What are they colluding to do? They're colluding to get people into debt. Debt is power, and how is it that this debt exercises the power? One of the things it does is for the ordinary person, it makes them insecure and unstable. So we're going to keep revisiting this theme of this relationship between power, or you could say elites, but power and the ordinary person throughout the talk. But financialization is part of the was one of the levers. So one example of this is student loans, right? So debt deepens at every level, but to dig into just student loans, there's this concept of credential inflation. So we had a previous talk about inflation in general, monetary inflation, and it simply means that your purchasing power decreases. You can buy less stuff. That's what inflation means when it's monetary inflation. What's credential inflation? Credential inflation would be your credentials. So let's say your degree. It also allows you to obtain less things, less stature, less jobs. Well, what happens when you do that? Well, you got to have more credentials. Okay. What when you need more credentials, what happens? You need to take out new student loans. A great deal of them being the federal student loans, which you can't bankrupt yourself out and get out of. Where does that money go? It's service when you pay for that money, and when you pay for those debts, when you service those loans, that is a slice that goes from your future wages to the financial institutions. So that's one layer of this concept that Graeber is really talking about is engineered. You have another with local government. This one is where you have fines, fees, and the enforcement of both the fines and the fees really having it's kind of a feedback loop that goes back to power as well and financial institutions as well, because you'll find out that a lot of the enforcement around property is not for an ordinary person's property, it's for elite property. So he
Mhm.
wrestles a lot about with that in the book and his throughout his other books. You'll see a disproportionate amount of power or amount of force and enforcement around property that happens to be elite property. So that's part of the extraction he says there. Now, the idea of this wealth, power, and more wealth loop, you have wealth, and this is kind of just intuitive, and you have political power, and the political power allow is a feedback loop back into more wealth. Why? Because you have legislation, loopholes, and even just more debt schemes that funnel back to the 1%, which Graeber talks about 1% mostly being financial, the financial institutions.
Mhm.
Now, the we are 99%, what is that and why is that important? The 99% is an identification of the ordinary person whose life and interests are excluded. All of what they care about, they're excluded. They themselves are excluded from the elite decision making processes. So, everyone who is excluded, you're part of the 99%. And the 1%, they're the ones that can make that they're part of the decision making process that actually, have impact on everyone.
Hmm. Hmm. And I mean, when we think about that 1%, we can think about, super large mega corporations. We can think about Congress. We can think about people who hold powers, um, you know, in very high levels in society. I mean, and I want to go back to, what Graeber identifies, as the crisis, pretty much a feedback loop. Wealth becomes power, which is used to capture institutions, which are then used to extract more wealth. This isn't a bug, it's the feature of a captured ledger. The phrase, we are the 99%, was so powerful because it was the first time in a generation that a massive group of people named the excluded majority and pointed to the shared source of their extraction.
Yeah, I mean, the way I take it, this is probably more of a discussion question, but I feel the financial systems today limit freedom more than enable it. How do y'all feel about that?
Absolutely. I
100%.
I I mean, I think of debt essentially as, I mean, it's a way of modern day slavery,
Yeah,
right? I mean, in order
exactly.
to pay it off, you have to abide by the standards that they set for you to make that money back.
Yep.
What they can find as legal, what is an acceptable job, what they deem as a high paying job. I mean, it's a bunch of mind games.
Yep.
Yep. So, what does Graeber say democracy means? So, in the United States, you have this idea of what is this everyday politics. You engage in voting in the West and the United States, and then because the connotation that the United States is a democracy, the implied idea that United States is a democracy, you believe that you're participating in a democracy, right? But your action is elections. You're electing. Now, if you reject the system, so that is you reject everyday politics, you're called anti-democratic. But Graeber points out that there's some type of deeper ideal that's happening and in people's mind, a deeper intuition of what democracy really means. So there's some kind of idea of freedom or liberty and some type of idea of self-governance. So this idea, you have the monarchs, so you have kings, and then there wasn't any self-governance there, right? They had the aristocracy, everybody under them. And so people don't think of that as liberty at all. But then when you have an elected representatives, you have some kind of idea of governance because you elected them. But if you were to call that self-governance, it's a stretch. And when you point it out and lay it bare, this is one of the things he says about doing general assemblies and occupying all this. You're showing people these other possibilities of decision making, and it's a true self-governance. And then you're kind of any response to that, any type of trying to stop that, it allows people to see, oh, power doesn't like when people actually do self-governance. That's kind of the idea of Occupy.
Yeah, I think one of the critiques that I take from this is democracy. The term democracy has become just a brand word almost in a sense. It's just used to legitimize, systems that aren't actually democratic.
Hmm. Hmm.
Exactly.
definitely a mode of, I guess, social programming, right? That word is supposed to make you feel a certain way, even though, I mean, it's kind of been skewed.
100%. And we'll get into it some more when we get into the different claims. So here, even right here, so we have democracy as a designed process, a designed thing in the United States. What does that mean? Graeber says the founding texts do not call what the US is a democracy. It's, and you may have heard this before. We have a republic. We don't have a democracy. You may have heard people say that before. What does that mean? Historically, democracy meant popular assemblies. They did not like democracy. The word was actually a pejorative term. Why? Why was it negative? Because for many different reasons. But one of them is they believed, and so you have the Federalist Papers, and you had James Madison, who's one of the writers in the Federalist Papers. But they believed that in a democracy, if you actually have people making decisions, what's going to happen? There's going to be factionalism. This is what they said. There's going to be demagoguery. So people using sophistry and pointing and creating insiders and outsiders in order to leverage power. And eventually you're going to have a dictatorship. That's why they said that democracy was bad, was one of the reasons. They also were scared. Madison was also concerned about people getting together, doing popular decision making, and then having radical views, outcomes, which one of those would be what Graeber says is something like debt cancellation, saying, oh, we're going to have a debt jubilee, no more debt, right? This is something that seems impossible for an ordinary thought. This is one of the things he says is a revolution. But historically, going back to democracy, elections were not considered democracy. They were a way, they weren't a way of, you may think elections where anyone could get elected historically. No, it was a way to elect people that were already in the aristocracy. So people who already were in the elite class, they had hereditary relations to some type of king or some type of thing like that, right? And you could elect from that group, and that was it. Or they were the only ones that had the ability to vote. So that's what elections were in the Republic and the Roman times and all this. So that did not mean democracy. Democracy meant, if you go back to the Greeks, it was something different. So now, and then also, I should say here also, Graeber says a controversial take. Graeber says the Greeks did not invent democracy. Democracy is just consensus. So it's pretty, it's kind of a patronizing take to say, oh, the West invented consensus or invented decision making of a group without elites. No, there's plenty of anthropological evidence of people all across the world for thousands of years doing consensus without having a strict hierarchy all over the place. So no, the Greeks didn't invent that, if you were to say that that's what democracy is. Now, another thing to point out is sortition. We have sortition. What is that? It's when you have a lottery for your decision makers. So you have that in juries here. And it's quite an interesting coincidence that we only have sortition for juries. So we know what it is. Oh, we want to rotate decision makers, because if you keep having the same decision makers, there could be corruption. So you need to have a lottery, but we don't do it anywhere else. So even with a republic where you're having a rotation, we know about it, but we still don't do that. That should be, an eye opener for you if you're big on republics and you know about the solution to corruption, right? Um, so his argument or his take on the history of democracy is that it was purposefully relabeled, branded, like Drew said earlier, in order to have the cake and eat it too. So you can call yourself democratic, even though you oppose self-government and general assemblies, any type of form of that. You can oppose that and still call yourself democratic because you are pro-election. And the Graeber's like, that's completely ahistorical.
Yeah, I kind of see it as like ancient democracy was direct participation, where modern is it's kind of filtered representation.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that the electoral college, that is a perfect example of it. I
Yeah.
mean, a true democracy is everybody would be, voting on everything as a collective. But I mean, those are aspects of a republic by having representation for you.
Yep.
Selecting your state representative.
Yeah, the electoral vote system is perfect example of that.
Hmm.
One state can
Yeah.
decide who becomes the leader.
Yep.
We see it
Yep.
almost every election cycle.
Hmm.
Hmm. Yeah. The electoral problem is even worse. It's like the worst part of the republic. So you didn't even get who you really want to vote for. Some people have outsized power towards what they want to elect, who they want to elect, and of course that was engineered as well. Um, so even with a republic, you don't have self-governing is the point. Um, so what does Occupy do? If the system that the elites created is captured, so these different institutions, they're captured, make it visible. And so now a big part of Occupy is narrative warfare. Make it visible. You can't have the cake and eat it too. General Assembly, right? That's where you do direct democracy, and we're going to talk about what that is. You doing it, practicing it as the message, and the response. You try to get that into the media. That's part of the narrative warfare. Now, this idea of consensus. Consensus isn't voting. What is consensus? At a high level, it's a group coming together like adults and trying to arrive at a decision that everyone could live with. It isn't that everyone is happy with or loves. It's that what everyone can live with. But it's not voting. And he has a strong position on consensus and how to leverage it, how to use it in these general assemblies. And then you may have some pushback on this idea of there's going to be a large amount of chaos, especially if you saw some of the narratives around Occupy, a large amount of the chaos of everyone getting together and voting on every single thing. That's not doable, especially in the era before cell phones and all this. But the pushback on that is there is a process of using subsidiaries. So using smaller groups, you can think of it as committees and things. So if you were in this sense, at Occupy, you have someone on board, a small group onboarding people. You have another group making signs, so on and so forth. And then they only bring problems to the General Assembly, to everyone, when they need to. And so that's this extreme decentralization as much as possible in order to make the system work.
I could think of it pretty much as like, silos, within an organization, right? You have like the marketing team has their own little function, and then you have like the sales team may have their own little function, but they all get together and they discuss, the overall plan of what they're trying to do at the all hands meetings and stuff like that.
Yep. So Occupy, I want to say started, I won't say it necessarily started, but a big part of Occupy was this place called Zuccotti Park. So that's where on the news, if you remember, you saw the way the news presented it, mass media presented it, it looked like a bunch of homeless people in the park with these little shanty towns and tents and things. But there was more to it than that. Part of what they did, it wasn't in just the park. There were other places that they, assembled. You can go to a private area, like say if someone owned, let's say a private library or some type of private um, property, and they have a big front steps area, you could protest there. And since it's private property, there's legal ambiguity on what I'll say the police, but you can say mercenaries for the elite, right? The arm of the elite that's going to have that has the capability of doing legal authorized force, let's say. There's limitations to what they're doing. Why does that matter? Why did Graeber care about that? You want to be able to extend some kind of fig leaf for the middleman, the person that is exerting the force. You want for them to be able to say, well, we couldn't do anything. They're on private property. So they're reporting back to the elites saying, hey, we couldn't do anything about this. We know you want us to do something, but our hands are tied. And you like that. So legal ambiguity can hurt you. It also can help you. This is a reoccurring theme with Graeber, where he talks about you need to have moving or changing tactics and adjust. Legal ambiguity is one of the places where you're going to do those adjustments. So, but what happens then is, oh, well, they couldn't do an eviction, which is, kicking you off of the property, kicking you off of that space. And if you resist, you go to jail, that kind of thing. But now they do petty harassment. We'll talk about petty harassment, but it basically creates a chilling effect for everyone who wants to join. Now, what did they do in Zuccotti Park? What did Occupy, basically what they're doing? Time, community, and working groups. We talk about the subsidiaries. All of that together, they did inside of these general assemblies. We'll talk about some of the specifics of what they were doing there, but they're practicing democracy. They also leveraged the reusable routines that people got used to, and they use hand signals. This, again, they're practicing democracy. What are they making decisions about, you may ask? They were making decisions about how to occupy an area while being protested. So it's kind of while being the threat of authorized force being leveled against them. So it's kind of reflexive. You're there and you're making decisions, group self-governing decisions about being there and demonstrating that to the world. Hopefully you're getting on mass media. Why did Occupy spread? So it was easy to copy because it was simply doing general assemblies in a public area. It spread throughout the nation. There was Occupy all different areas and cities in the nation, but also worldwide. There's Occupy in Spain, Madrid, and all these other places. There was civil disobedience. Of course, you're going to have all kinds of characters showing up, sometimes provocateurs, people that they're purposefully there to sabotage. And then there's going to be police violence videos that make their way onto mass media and social media. That made people pay attention. They would go down to places like Zuccotti Park just to see what's going on. And then they would end up, you couldn't tell the difference between them and the people that were part of Occupy, right? Sometimes. And so it made the movement grow. Then eventually you had the union support, broader participation from what I'm saying, from all of the attention. So this whole idea of democracy, so self-governing general assemblies, Graeber keeps saying repeatedly that if you were internal to the General Assemblies, internal to the Occupy, you got exposed to the decision making processes that increased possibilities, widen your view of what the normal would be. This is the whole idea of the revolution. And then when you left, you went back to your workplace or whatever, and you knew, oh, you can actually do things in a consensus manner, a general assembly, or direct democracy, and it actually be effective. They were going against, people that had, in some cases, uh, they could use authorized force against them.
Yeah, I think Graeber emphasized that it's democracy spreads through participation, not through just messaging.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Now, you may be wondering, what's the pushback on any type of really activism, but this type of activism with the General Assemblies and all this stuff. And Graeber has a history in the book where he talks about different protest movements, activism, and there's a playbook. So you got to smear what's called you smear them as radicals. They may not be radicals, but you smear them as radicals. You say they're violent, even though they're not violent. You could even have provocateurs that go in and break windows and say, "Oh, look, they're violent. They're terrorists because they're doing property violence." You could say they're filthy. They did this with people in the Occupy movement. They were saying that they were openly, defecating in the park and all this stuff, even though it could not be true. And you say they're chaotic. So they're saying, oh, they don't have any demands. So they're leaderless. And so they're really, it's a bunch of kids that don't know, or hippies that don't know what they want. Now, if you do that, smearing the radicals, then you want to peel allies out. And this is quite interesting how Graeber talks about this. But if you have any leadership structure in your movement, the people that are representing power, so the arm of power, so in this case, the police, they want to negotiate with someone. And when they negotiate with that person, oh, this is the leader, now we're going to basically try to peel them away and have it to where, using various tactics, have it to where they're kind of operating on our side. And you can also, whatever you get this person to say, you can also leverage that against everyone else, as far as, oh, they said something illegal, the whole group is illegal. When you don't have any leadership structure, that frustrates this technique of the peeling of allies. But then after they peel allies, then they do their attack, coordinated eviction. So, oh, you were violating a city ordinance here. This group was. Now we can evict you. Let's go through and do that. And we're doing it in an authorized way. So the back and forth is going to be, power wants, a big part of power is legitimacy. If you do something where you just take away people's rights, like say you have no free speech and you don't have freedom of movement, we're just going to beat you down when we see you. That is expensive because it makes power illegitimate. Power wants to stay legitimate because it's less expensive to enforce when you have legitimacy. Resistance and activism wants to fight and take away that legitimacy. They want to expose and lay bare the violence that power wants to demonstrate or expose or put on people who are doing their activism. So they're just like how people who are doing any type of activism or resistance to power or anything, or trying to, in a positive way, like what Graeber would say, trying to exercise their freedoms, there's going to be a pushback of power when they see, oh, there's things there that we need to contain.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw this in police. You saw this in the media, where there was a use of force, and whenever police, right, or you could say the arm of elite, uses force, it's called authorized use of force. whenever, and it could be actual violence, hitting someone with a baton. Whenever someone that is on the resistance side, the media can frame it as violence, even if it's breaking a window, it's violence, and then it takes away the legitimacy of the activism side. So this is the battle that with the narrative warfare.
Yep. I mean, and propaganda is always going to be a huge piece of it. And it's you have when you have power, you have more of an ability to reach masses, right? The little man can't, actually say what they're trying, what their motive is or what the mission is, especially with, with smaller groups that are trying to exercise their freedoms, as Graeber said. But I mean, if you have money and you have media behind you, you can say whatever you want and paint the picture for the people.
Mm-hmm. We see this now in our media every day almost.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, the critique of Occupy, if you've ever heard of anything about Occupy, is that they had no agenda. It was a bunch of hippies or homeless people doing nothing but taking up a park. And so it was chaos or what have you. Now, what Graeber is saying is that Occupy's agenda was to make non-democracy, undemocracy obvious. How? By practicing general assemblies, and then any resistance that will lay bare that elites don't like actual democracy. They don't like self-governing. Now, one of the things that Graeber was against was having a list of demands, having a list of policies, saying this is what we want. Why is that not matter? Because they're easy to ignore. In other movements, people come up with demands and the media just ignores them, says nobody really cares about what they're saying, or they'll put it in a negative light. And it's just easy to ignore. People in the own movement can ignore what the demands are. The practicing, this is kind of like, you can think of the saying, practice what you preach, but this is practice and don't preach. It's only practice. Now, when you have an assembly, you practice, that's much harder to ignore. So, and again, Graeber is big on talking about everyday politics in the West, in the United States. That's not democracy. What is democracy? He's saying it's what direct democracy is. It's consensus, and we're going to get into what he means there. Now, we have the 4 counterintuitive claims of the book. Democracy scares rulers. What does that mean? We talked about it some already, but we're going to dig a little bit more into it. Now, we also, in claim 2, assembly is the message, general assembly. What is a general assembly, right? And what is the message? Number 3, very counterintuitive. Consensus is anti-coercion. That's implying that non-consensus is coercion, like voting is coercion. What does he mean by that? We'll get into that. And then also claim 4, we hit on this, but revolutions are really about a change in what people think is normal. It's change in common sense. It's not necessarily like the French Revolution, violence, the terror, the American Revolution, lots of violence. And that's what changes people's minds. It's not necessarily that. There are other revolutions that have happened. So claim number 1, democracy scares rulers. What in the world does this mean? Repression reveals the fear of democracy breaking out. What? When you do a general assembly, and there's all this pushback on, we're going to talk about the specifics with the pushback, there's a unique response by the elite, which is financial elite in the United States, to the protests of the 1%. There's if you protest, one of the things Graeber says, if you protest something that people don't care about, nobody stops you. No one sends the police out. No one does any of that. You protest what elites care about. And one of the things there, his argument is that they're actually scared of people starting to self-govern. And he goes through history showing explicitly when people are saying they don't like that, elite saying that. Then you're going to have an evidenced pushback of power. They're using their different levers, authorized use of force being the major one. You have this idea of they created all types of very off the wall ways of trying to contain Occupy. They had cages out there with that people had to get in order to do their protests. And then they also had these different bans, banning signs, banning speech, 4-letter words, banning raising your voice. They're very arbitrary and escalating in nature in order to have this chilling effect. But why? Why was this disproportionate response happening? And Graeber is saying that the core cause is the message that institutionalized bribery is something you cannot diagnose, you can't talk about, you can't create systems to try to combat that. When you do that, and you see that the repression, anything you do, if you see a repression that happens, then that's the tell.
Yeah, if it didn't matter, they wouldn't try to stop it, right?
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of a reference from the Ants movie. It was this was like maybe in the late 90s, where the crickets were basically making these ants farm up a whole bunch of food,
Yeah.
right? And they had this control game. And then there was one time a cricket had asked the other one, he said, why are you telling them that they can't do this? And it was like, well, we can't let the ants know that there's more of them compared to us.
Yeah.
Or else they will just take over, you know?
That is
The
funny.
best part about that movie was when I think it was grasshoppers actually.
Grasshoppers, yes.
The bird ate the grasshopper.
Oh,
There's always someone above.
Yep.
Yeah. So we have a diagram here. Democracy breaks out. So that's assemblies and mutual aid. People helping one another. There's a rich history of people helping one another. So doing things like having a breakfast for children or lunch, free lunch for children. And there being a crackdown by state disproportionately because it's people they're doing self-governing, and there's some of the power being taken back. They're really exercising their own freedoms, and it creates a repression, a response. So how does this happen? What power does, right, is co-opt whatever action into existing institutions. You can think about this and like say you can do left and right party politics. You can think about like an example I said where you could have free lunches, free breakfast, that kind of thing, and then saying, okay, no, we're going to have a state-run version of that, and we're going to make it illegal for you to do that. This type of co-opting takes away power from people. Self-governing is what Graeber is saying is a problem. You also want to delegitimize. That's narrative warfare. We've been talking about that. If you are seeing democracy, you want to say that's not legitimate. Of course, you want to ban things, and then you start using force, authorized use of force. You kind of want to use that as a last resort because there's blowback with legitimacy. If you use force when people are exercising what it's seen to be freedoms, then you lose your legitimacy, and there's blowback. We talked about the freedom cages. They're still barriers where they split everyone into groups of 20 and said, hey, you can hang out in these cages and you'll be fine. You can protest in there. So it's completely a spectacle. Escalating bans. So they banned signs. They banned all cardboard. So you can have any cardboard, making somewhere to sit on or anything. And then they went into arrests. And then you also had this idea of, I guess the slang term for it is a humble. So in certain cases, an officer can arrest you for no reason at all, as long as they don't charge you. And he talks about this. Graeber does talk about this in the book. As long as they don't charge you, then they don't get in trouble. There are certain cases where they can do that. And if it becomes a wide thing, then there's going to be pushback, obviously. So some elite kid goes down there and they get arrested for no reason. Now you're in trouble as your police, right? So you don't want to do too much. But they do have the capability. They really don't want to charge you when they want to exercise the power of this chilling effect with the arresting, right? So you're going to be able to, there's a hardcore who are looking for civil disobedience and arrest, inappropriate arrest, and have the pushback and lawsuit, but then they're not going to charge you. And so in order to avoid that pushback.
And we're kind of seeing that arresting in real time now with, just with all the ICE stuff going on.
Yep.
People are not getting their due process like they're being told. They're just being detained. But of course, it's a whole other scenario where they're getting deported instead of getting sent to jail. So, but I kind of see the same similarity of what's going on now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And I mean, to really drive this one home, I think the first claim is that democracy is genuinely frightening to those in power. The proof is in their reaction. They don't issue permits. They build freedom cages and use arbitrary arrest. Why? Because an assembly of people self-governing is a direct existential threat. It proves that their authority is not necessary. The response loop, co-op, delegitimize, repress is the playbook for any system facing a truly decentralized competitor.
Exactly. So now claim number 2, the assembly is a message. We talked about this a bunch. What's the product? We want to produce a new way of deciding together. And his view is this, it's consensus in the General Assembly. Assemblies can spread to everywhere, every block, every workplace. There's nothing stopping you from doing an assembly. They also do these in New Hampshire. They actually have general assemblies that are implemented where they do direct democracy on like a city level and even up to the state level, but definitely city level. So it isn't just elected representatives all throughout the United States. Some people really do appreciate general assemblies. Now in the Occupy context, you have these camps. They also had what's called mutual aid. So people helping one another in order to take away the reliance or demonstrating self-governing and taking away the reliance on power. So you had kitchens, you had libraries, you had people caring for one another, like healthcare, that kind of thing. And all of that creates an even greater repression and greater resistance, which of course you're doing narrative warfare. You want that to be seen, in order to attack legitimacy. So again, this whole 99%, we talked about the identity, which is very important. Identifying people who are excluded from elite decision-making. That's the 99%. So creating this shared we and identify and bring people in. So a little diagram here. You have the content focus. If you have demands and policy, we talked about this already, it's easy to ignore. If you have a practice focus, So assembly, general assembly, and process is very hard to ignore. And then that's kind of a trap, because if you don't ignore and you try to repress, now you're on video, especially now with social media. You're on video repressing people just trying to exercise a democracy. So you're gonna lose legitimacy. So it's expensive. So and this is where Graeber talks about the messages of practice and people can self-govern. And there's no excuse for you not doing it right now. You can do it at any time. One of the things they used within Occupy is the people's mic. Now, again, the different things, various things being banned, they banned amplification. You can't use a loudspeaker. So people would say a speech. And this was one of the things that people, when it was covered in the news, it was looked at as like a chaos thing. So you had people in Occupy that went down there that were big named leader, well-known leaders. You had people from Congress there. You also had people that were leaders within that you would think that had the same, and they did. They had the same goals as what the 99% would be. And then, but they were showcasing that they're not letting them speak. And so what was that about? Well, the way that you could speak, they Occupy was really big on stopping speechifying, what they call speechifying. So people giving a big speech and then dominating and becoming a hierarchy. So how did they do that? They used the people's might. Why? So this was, you said a part of your speech, so it probably was just like one line, and then people that were too far away from your voice, further out, they would repeat, or people just within the range, they would repeat what you're saying so people further away can hear. And this had the effect of making it so where people wouldn't give long drawn out speeches. People basically had a chance everybody had a chance to speak to a certain extent. The leaders that would normally give the normal people who would ascend to leadership, that were used to giving big speeches and things like that, they had to be more concise in what they're saying. And also, if somebody said something offensive, people just wouldn't repeat it. And this also, again, had this effect of making the movement leaderless or flat. And that helped in the resistance to those who would use what you could call authorized use of force, or the arm of the elite. So we'd say the police. Police have intelligence, they're insiders, that kind of thing. They were rendered much more useless because they really couldn't gather any intelligence, because there wasn't any one group that they could go to. Even if you were to go to Graeber, who really coined some of these terms, by the way. I think he coined the 99%. He may have coined Occupy. But they really could, if they could seek him out, they really couldn't. It really didn't matter.
It kind of reminds me of like the current Antifa type, stance. Like they labeled them a terrorist group, but who are you going after? Like it could be anyone.
Yeah.
Anyone walking down the street.
Yep. Anyone with that shared ideology that they don't want fascism.
Like I share some of that ideology. Are you going to arrest me? Like I, probably agree with a lot of what they stand for. Am I a terrorist now? Like I could get arrested just for, it's kind of crazy to think of it that way.
Yeah. And Graeber talks about this in the book. So the whole idea of there's force, there's terrorism, there's all these things. He of course says be nonviolent. This is a Gandhian way, and you want to showcase the violence being used on you is really the Gandhian way. But you have different views of tactics, so there's going to be internal debates. So of course the violence, the argument that Graeber uses is not pragmatic, like the same thing with Gandhi. But You also have ideas against where somebody's going to suggest property violence. His whole pushback on that was, okay, don't do it, but also don't put it in the same category as someone getting hit in the head with a baton. That's a different level of
Yeah,
violence.
that's escalation for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So but the media is going to do that, but you internally should not do that when someone else says, well, let's break these windows or whatever. You could say, yeah, don't break the windows. It's going to go against what we want to do. But at the same time, when you see it, you don't say, oh, they are on the same level as somebody who is kidnapping people.
Yeah. I think a good example of like nonviolence, you don't hear of any arrests, was just the recent No Kings. It's the third one. Like, I didn't hear of anyone getting hit, you know, any type of violence, anything. It was just simple protest and ideology.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And I want to go back to the human microphone. What do we call it?
The people's mic.
The people's mic, right? I mean, essentially it's like you're relaying messages, right? On a mesh network, right? You have all of these people that are essentially playing telephone and repeating a message. So, I mean, it's not just one head, at the very top disseminating the message, but you have people relaying it. That's literally decentralization at its finest. And I want to loop that back to say this is probably the most important lesson for builders. Occupy's no agenda wasn't a weakness; it was a point. It lists a policy of demands. Um, Listing a policy of demands is easy to ignore or co-opt, but functioning assembly where people are practicing direct democracy is a product in itself. It's a virus, right? The way that it just travels amongst them. The people's mic wasn't just a workaround, it was a feature that forced listening and made the process portable. The message wasn't we want X, it was we can decide together right now being a badass without you.
Yeah, I couldn't say it better. That's correct. There's another thing I want to put in there. As far as when we're talking about democracy and we're talking about movements, Graeber talks about activism. He talks about WTO, which happened in the 90s. He talks about the Zapatistas and all these other groups that were like anti-globalist, and he documents them like using like an anthropologist's ethnography and tries to document behaviors and all this stuff. One of the things that he points out that I think is very important is he says that power has obviously adjusted, it adjusts, and it has taken the capabilities of activism and uses it throughout the world. So these techniques of activism, protest, so on and so forth, happening in the United States and abroad, they may be instances of power doing the activism. What I wanted to say is, if you are having it be a self-governed democracy, it's not an instance of that. You will see, and he talks about this in the book, they would have all of this infighting where it's basically a non-organic activist protest. And you can tell because there's a hierarchy in the inside of the protest. And so it's basically fake. But you can't have a fake consensus-driven General Assembly that's operating as a protest. And that would be something that I would think Graeber is no longer with us. But if he were to critique some of the activism that's happening now, you can be sure he would be saying, if you're not doing these General Assemblies, it's not organic. Because they've already adapted. Everything that are within that happens within activism throughout the world elite here, covert power, that is way more effective than war. They abuse it in every country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I mean, essentially setting the narrative, and I can't stress that enough. I mean, and I think that's probably a recurring theme in all of the books is whoever has the power to set the narrative, that is that is ultimately going to be the ultimate force.
So now we got consensus is anti-coercion. Some of this is, I find to be true, but very counterintuitive. So consensus, it's a synthesis of what everybody's thinking in that group. It's not a voting rule. Going back to this is not electing an aristocratic official. What you're trying to do is you're trying to come up with something that everyone can live with. And when everyone's deciding, so you have people coming through, discussing, proposing, and then deciding, and they're doing it with an equal footing. This is where you have this is where you have a consensus, and we're going to talk about it in the next slide. But there's these ways of protesting in the consensus called blocking, but he gives a very specific way that you can legitimately do a block. Of course, people can do block on whatever they try to, they can raise their hand and say, I want to block. But he has a guideline for what a legitimate blocking is. And we'll talk about that. But the whole idea is he's implying and directly saying that voting is coercion, counterintuitively. If you didn't agree to being governed by voting by 51%. So here's how he describes what consensus is in this Occupy context and some of his other contexts. So you have people making proposals. Of course, people are going to respond with their concerns. And then you can modify the proposals and you check consent using hand signals. You consent yay or nay. Someone can consent, someone can stand aside. They just say, okay. But then there's this block principle. What is that? The principle blocks. So the idea is when you come together as a self-governed group, there are certain principles that are moral principles that you all either implicitly or explicitly agree with. But you can say, okay, we're going in a certain direction that is violating a moral principle. So you could say, you come together and someone says, I'm going to do some property violence. You could say, I think that's against my moral principle. And I'm going to block. What a blocking simply means is that I'm willing to leave this group over this. And so when someone does a block, you should have a way of addressing when someone's blocking, because they're charging you with going against moral principles of the group. So why not a 59 or 51%, 49% vote? He talks about this a bunch. Again, we're talking with elections, saying that they're really not democratic. Public assemblies, they don't have any public agreement or prior agreement. People come together and you didn't have any agreement on, again, even the moral side. So majority rule, let's raise your hands and vote. It's not legitimately binding, right? So to legitimately bind someone to a procedure, that's going to require unanimous consent. So you need to come together. This is kind of again, in the book and some of his other books, he talks about in political history. Remember, he's an anthropologist. In political science, there's a lot pulled from what is called the social contract. So this is Thomas Hobbes, and a pushback on that, or another view of that would be Jacques Rousseau. But this idea of a social contract, your government is legitimate. He called it the Leviathan. It's legitimate because it's basically more efficient. You have the war of all against all. Everyone's fighting everyone. And then so you have this government that forms that takes over the role of issuing violence. So if someone steals from you, your neighbor steals from you, before you would go over there and steal back from him or take back, now it's government that does that for you. That's the Leviathan, and that's the necessary evil, all this. The idea of a social contract is that implicitly, you being born in that area, you implicitly have signed a social contract with that government to do that and to get away from the war of all against all. This is Thomas Hobbes. He's saying that you didn't, if you didn't, and you may have a pushback if this is your first time hearing that, you may have a pushback and say, that doesn't sound legitimate. I didn't, just because I was born in an area doesn't mean that I'm in some social contract or some weirdness. And his thing is, I mean, he's kind of is an anarchist. He kind of believes that it's not legitimate that you're in this, so there should be other ways. He also levels a critique of everything I just said, because as being an anthropologist, it's like that's very much a Western idea of history and political science and all of this other stuff, and it does not agree with an anthropological view of cultures. It's really a philosophical view where it was created without the knowledge of cultures that we now have. So he really looks down on some of that very classic philosophy. In any case, equal say means there is no coercion if everyone has equal say. And of course, you want to decentralize. We talked about that before. So this is why you don't do, or he prefers consensus as the legitimate way and not voting unless you agree to voting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, to say many people mock consensus as inefficient, but Graeber frames it as a moral choice. In a public assembly with no prior agreement, there is no legitimate basis for 51% of people to force 49 to do something. Consensus, with its concern, stand aside, and block functions, is a process to find synthesis without coercion. It's a system designed to protect principles and ensure that no one is forced to assent to something they fundamentally object to.
All right, so now we got claim 4. Revolutions change common sense. Again, we talked about this earlier, but you have French Revolution, American Revolution, those are violent revolutions, and has this controversial take is that that's not really what a revolution is, or a broader concept of revolution is when what people think as normal changes. So we talked about this, but this is when you could say something like democracy. We had monarchs, we had kings. There were no people doing any idea of self-government. And then there was an American Revolution, right? So that was a violent revolution. There was fighting. But really, Graeber's view is that the change of what is possible. So now it's common sense that you can have a whole nation that's governed in some, at least with a head nod towards democracy. So, but a republic. But it's a possibility to be run without monarchs. And that was a revolution in that sense. And in the whole Occupy view, after having a real democratic meeting, his view is that you can't go back. You now see that it's possible to self-govern without having top-down command and control. That shift in your political common sense is what happens. When you're having all of these debates inside of a General Assembly, with that freedom, you're not going to be debating what's common sense. You don't care about what's normal because you don't even, it lives under the conscious mind. You take it for granted. You're going to be debating fringe ideas. You can only do that, of course, when you have the freedom to debate fringe ideas. When the fringe ideas become common sense, that's a revolution. That's really what he's saying. And he also is saying it's not going to come from the law. The law is always second. There's a common sense revolution first. Then you have people changing the laws afterwards. So you shouldn't be looking for the elite to change the law. You shouldn't be looking. This is a critique of Western democracy, as we could call it, what he calls everyday politics. You should not be looking towards your representatives to change the law to where you have more freedoms. It goes the other way around.
Yeah, I think laws follow beliefs, right? Not the other way around.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep.
So here's what a revolution would be inside of a diagram. Of course, you're practicing first, and this is Graeber's view. And then you have the narrative warfare. You have stories that you need to come up with, or your description. And you're going to have, of course, your oppressors or the people trying to contain, they're going to have their stories for what you're doing, right? At some point, if you win, the new norms are going to be taken for granted. People will look back and they will wonder how anyone thought any different. So this is kind of this paradox that Graeber talks about and uses to critique culture, even going back to ancient times, where he talks about possibilities and people coming together and debating with one another. The idea of new possibilities and how open a culture is to new possibilities, that's part of this level of this norms and this revolution. Of course, afterwards, then you have institutions that adopt it, and now you can become more stratified, and everybody's just going to agree. Then the laws follow, like we said. This is how change happens. Within inside of a consensus, you may be scared, of that whole idea of, okay, we have to have something that everyone can live with. But what about that unreasonable person? Some of what Graeber says is that for an adult, if you infantilize someone, if you treat them like an infant, you treat them as a non-adult. So basically, you use coercion in order to force them. That makes them a non-adult. The only way to get someone to take responsibilities to act like an adult, as an adult, is to give them to not use coercion and to engage with them as an adult. So you have a paradox. There's no way around it. You have to approach that person that you think is unreasonable. They probably have been infantilized, a good part of their life, and it's your job in order to engage them, and then go ahead and they have the concept of blocking and all of this stuff like that. But you can't fall into the trap of, oh, we need elites in order to have command and control, because we have some people who are problem children, basically.
Mhm. It kind of makes me think about the restrictions of, say, I mean, there's a lot of laws coming out right now all across the West about, what websites people can and cannot visit, right? And it's kind of being implemented from up top. It's not it's saying, "Oh, we don't think that you're adult enough to know that these sites are dangerous. So we're going to just go ahead and take it, and just say you're going to have to KYC or ID yourself before you get on the internet, right? To make sure that you're doing the right thing that we
Yeah,
believe is
that's
right."
right. Yeah. They're even doing it with operating systems. They're saying
Mhm.
you need to have it built into the open source software. So, again, like leads into this bullet point here. Tactics have to adapt to the context. So whenever uh, this idea he has, you have your freedoms because someone at some point exercised those freedoms before power contained. And
Yeah.
so, oh, you have choke points where someone can take away your ability to use an operating system without the KYC.
Mhm.
So now, the fight is on, the race is on. Is there going to be, what's the pushback to that? How is that going to, be implemented? And that's a United States thing. So maybe people will be hosting outside the United States or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it definitely sounds more like a power play when you step back and you just, look at it objectively.
Yeah. I would think a good way to look at it is capture the flag. So when you have the flag, they're coming for you. They have the
Hmm.
flag, you're coming for them. This is power.
Hmm.
And you have the tactics that are available to you. If you keep using the same tactics, they're going to adjust. So you're going to have to be dynamic, and they're going to be dynamic. If you're on the resistance side, you have the 99%. You have population on your side. If on the other side, centralization, they're going to have elite. They're going to have some of the best um, think tanks and
Hmm.
smart people on their side or what have you. And so they're going to be quite good at their movements and adjusting, and they're really fast, but they don't have the broad consensus on their side of people. So the narrative warfare, and when we were talking about earlier, whoever controls the media, it's not free for the media to do whatever they want either. There's a legitimacy cost for media to say, I'm not going to show the violent videos,
Hmm.
even though
Hmm.
now on social media everyone can see it. It's like, oh, you lost legitimacy.
Yep.
So
Yep.
that's a fight as well.
Hmm. Because I mean, all of these media companies, I mean, they have money coming their direction, and they have people they have to respond to as well. So if their investors say that they want a certain narrative established, people with, power and money, then that is exactly the the picture that they're going to paint, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's their conundrum. That's the dilemma that they're in. They're captured by finance,
Mm.
but they will lose eyeballs, which they have. Independent media has there are independent media shows that have way more live viewers than MSNBC. All of the main anchors on MSNBC, they would
Yeah.
never, they could not hold a show at all on by themselves. If they were to go on a YouTube or something, they would tank. They have less than 50,000 views. So this is what it costs. You lose legitimacy if you and that goes for Foxy. You lose legitimacy when you have capture from
Hmm.
the monetary side.
Hmm.
And we
Hmm.
we see that too, because like the likes of like Glenn Beck, he got kicked off or he left the main network he was on. You never hear about him anymore.
Yeah.
Who else was recent? I think Tucker Carlson. You don't hear about him as often anymore. He
Oh
doesn't get
no,
the same.
no, Tucker Carlson is quite popular. He
He is getting
definitely
more popular. He
no,
is getting more popular
he is
as he
very
gains.
popular.
Yeah.
But the funny
he,
thing is if he kept up his like his Fox News persona, I think he would have
Mhm.
less followers. Because he's kind of
you're
changed.
you're
Yeah.
100% correct on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
I'm trying to think. There's someone else too, but yeah,
Candace Owens.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
she wasn't ever really mainstream. She was on another group, I want to say
Hmm.
the Daily Wire, but she left there, and then she started doing expanded, talking about different topics that were forbidden on
Hmm.
the Daily Wire. But I'm really talking about the real MSNBC, CNN, the main anchors
Yeah.
that they have, Fox News as well. When they decide not to cover, there's Occupy. They had views on Occupy, both sides. They both did not have favorable views of Occupy, both sides, because they're captured.
Hmm.
Now, when any of those, when they do that, of course, when there's now with social media, but even then, there's a police video of some violence that's happening and they don't show it, it's my point is it's not free. And they know internally, hey, this is a hot story. Remember before Twitter, they were like, oh, Twitter's nothing. And then, within a few years, they're showing someone's tweet and then they're talking about it like it's news. So they had to
Yeah.
adjust. That
Yeah.
same thing for it's a narrative warfare against also mainstream media, that it isn't just they win, is Graeber's view. I would say they have to pay as well. They have
Mhm.
costs with legitimacy. It isn't just legit elite legitimacy.
Yep. Yep. And I think that that's probably the number one fight for somebody with power against social media in general. It's like with Twitter, now X. I mean, it was raw, real, and instant. The news was here. So if the big outlets aren't reporting on it, it's that's kind of odd. This seems like a pretty large story not to cover, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, yeah. And I mean, so to wrap up claim 4, I want to leave with a quick reality check. The real win of a revolution isn't a new law; it's a shift in common sense. It's when an idea that was once fringe becomes the assumed reality. Graeber's model shows how it happens. First, you practice it, occupy, then you name it, we are the 99%, and then it becomes a norm, and finally it gets locked in by new institutions. The cultural shift always precedes the legislative one, not the other way around.
100%.
Yeah, it's kind of like what you said before, almost at the beginning, like revolutions don't start in the government. It's what people think is normal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So quick review of how not to burn out with the if you're doing some general assemblies. This concept of or whole idea of, oh, you have very long meetings, 14-hour long meetings. Don't do that. What that's going to do is privilege people who have the ability to endure 14 hours. So it's like, all right, set time limits aggressively for these meetings. Don't bring, we talked about this numerous times, but don't bring proposals to the General Assembly, and if you can hand them in the subsidiaries, right? You got to bring it if they're compelling. You need to have decentralization in these working groups. They'll okay. So going into this, the view of what politics is everyday, what he calls everyday politics, and he's saying that okay, we have this collective delusion, but power creates realities. What does he mean when he's saying power creates realities? Really, possibilities. So power is going to try to stratify what you think is possible. So in the United States, we don't believe that universal healthcare, for instance, is possible. That's one thing. Or it's like that would be just too expensive. Even though there's other countries that have it, we're just like it's kind of barely a possibility. Things like that. But direct democracy is his point. That itself is something that people think is impossible. With general assemblies and all that. And so you have to practice it. That's breaking the spell. Underneath all of power, what you want to lay bare, what you want to expose with power, is that it's really organized violence versus what a legitimate resistance and expression of freedom and exercising freedoms. That's not organized violence, it's the opposite. But
Mhm.
they're going through all of these hoops to make and reclassify force or violence as authorized use of force. But really, what's underneath it is organized violence. What your job is to do as someone's resisting that, you want to expose the brute force and to build what he calls a reasonable space. Okay, but when you build a reasonable space, you're going to have it to where you have resistance, and that natural resistance that elite is going to have, you want to expose it. This is this
Mhm.
whole cycle of you know fighting this narrative warfare.
Yeah. Yeah. And when it's not organized, it's when it's decentralized, it's going to be slow and messy. When it's centralized, it's going to be fast and, like you said, Watson, very well organized from the top. So if you see, something that's being implemented and it's being implemented swiftly, and you don't hear a consensus on social media about it, and it's only something that's come about because the powers that be are implementing it, that's probably because it's being done quick and fast, and it's being very organized.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, again, countering power, you want to build alternatives that people can live with. You need to keep reminding everyone what power rests on. And Graeber has various books, and it's a common theme within all of his books about bureaucracy and how, and we're not going to talk too much about that, but how bureaucracy is leveraged by elites. So when he says bureaucracy, he's talking about basically like bean counters, people recording ledgers, the people who control the ledger, which is interesting because we have the description of what money is as a ledger. But from our previous talk, but he's saying that bureaucracies, coercive bureaucracies, are part of what you're fighting against. All of these rule makers, not just rule makers, but bean counters, let's say. So now we have our conclusion. Democracy is a skill, like we said, practice it on purpose. Build small institutions, right? Don't build, like we said, with the general assemblies. You want to have all these working groups. You want to have the subsidiaries, right? So that's going to be a failure mode if you don't do that. If you have a situation where you have some type of hierarchy forming, go ahead and make who decides explicit, because you want to lay that bare within your group. It's not a general assembly anymore. So don't hide it. You know that they're going to have the smear playbook. They're going to come through and, of course, smear you, and you need to protect your own morale inside of your general assembly and measure success as a common sense shift. So what people think is the norm, that's how you measure, not in some other way where you may think that measuring by a new law, let's say, is the way that you would have that as a good output. And he's saying that that's not correct.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to leave with the one model here. So the one model is this: we have one model, one story, and one action. One model is democracy is a skill, it's not a status. You have to practice it. The goal is to build flexible counterpower, alternatives that people can actually live in, not just theoretical compromises. The one story is General Assembly. It proved that when you put people in a room and give them a process to self govern, they can do it, just like adults do. The process is the message. And the one action for everyone listening, tailored to what you're here for. If you're looking for an exit path from feeling powerless, your first step is to find and or create a small assembly in your own life. It doesn't have to be political. It could be a book club that uses consensus, a neighborhood mutual aid group, or a parents' co op that makes decisions collectively. Your goal is to practice the skill of self governance in a low stakes environment and build the muscle. If you're here to build the tools for this new world, your action is to build software that enables the assembly, not replace it. Don't build a platform that dictates the rules, build a protocol that provides the tools for a group to create their own rules. Think about tools for reputation without identity, for consensus without a central server, for treasury management without a bank. Build infrastructure for the practice, not the platform for the powerful.
Yeah, like build small real systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, changing what people believe is possible.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
100%. Yeah, and with that, we can go ahead and call a close to this. If you have any responses, go ahead and put them in the comments. Try to leave some evidence so we can check up. on whatever it is that you're saying. And don't forget to check out bitlemmas.com for more information in the history of our podcast. And thank you for joining us.
Cool. See you next week.
Yeah.